What's up guys, Flemel here, bringing you my guide for Discipline in Mythic Plus for patch 7.3.5. A little bit about myself. I've been playing since Vanilla and mained a Priest since Wrath. I was originally a Shadow Priest, but I made the swap to Discipline and have been playing it since the beginning of Legion. I'm a big fan of class loyalty, so although I made the switch when Discipline wasn't very strong, I've always worked really hard to make it work. Thankfully, we were buffed somewhat recently, and now it's nice and strong. I primarily play Mythic Plus, but I do dabble in raiding quite a bit. That being said, this guide is specifically for Mythic Plus. Just as an upfront disclaimer, this guide is going to go over how I choose to play Discipline. The wonderful double-edged sword about healing is that we tend to do a bit more feel crafting than theory crafting. If you do something a bit unorthodox, but it works for you, then that's all that matters. You may disagree with some aspects of this, and I'd love to hear about it in the comments so we can have a constructive conversation about it. Anyways, let's get into it. So why bring a Discipline Priest over other healers? Well, first and foremost, it's a lot of fun. If you enjoy caster DPS and a visceral feeling of contributing to your group outside of just keeping people alive, Discipline might be the spec for you. The awesome part about that is that the feeling carries over to lower Mythic Plus and simple pugs when there isn't that much damage going out. It's also a nice challenge. Even though we are a lot stronger than we were when I wrote my first guide, Discipline still requires a solid APM and a lot of pre-planning and knowledge of the pulls. Focusing more on our strengths and solid evidence though, Discipline can bring arguably the highest DPS to a group as the healer, rivaled only by Paladin. When played properly, I believe we can consistently outdamage them though. While our personal survivability is middle of the pack, we offer some of the strongest one-shot protections of all the healers, which is a big factor in higher keys. When someone would normally drop to a single ability, we have the ability to throw shields and absorbs on them to help keep them from that heartbreaking overkill when Pridas and personals aren't enough. So now that you've decided to try your hand at Priest, let's get into the specifics on how to approach Mythic Plus. Our stat priority is going to be haste first, crit second, verse third, and last but least, mastery. Haste you'll want to get to around 30%. Haste will lower your cast time, reduce the CD of powered shield, and increase your dot damage from Purge the Wicked. I've found that while it's still helpful beyond 30%, it falls a bit in value compared to other stats, and reduces your ability to balance it properly for little gain. Critical Strike is the second most important because, like Haste, it will benefit both your damage and healing. Since we not only do more healing through Atonement the more damage we can do, it's important not to neglect the fact that a large part of why we're brought to Mythic Plus is our DPS. It's very satisfying to see yourself actually represented on the damage meters, but it feels great when your Shadow Men can crit at a crucial moment to keep someone alive. Versatility is definitely a somewhat boring stat, but it can really shine in Mythic Plus. It's a flat boost to our damage and healing, but importantly, it's also a boost to our own survivability. While we won't be stacking it to insane levels, even a small percentage of damage reduction can be the difference between surviving something like Herja's Arcane Bolt and dying. Mastery is the lowest on the list because it only buffs our Atonement healing. Our Mastery got a nice buff in 7.3, and we want to be healing through Atonement as much as possible. It doesn't make that much of a difference to try and beat out crit, and it does nothing to help with our damage. Having Mastery on gear isn't the end of the world because it's still a good stat, but I wouldn't target it specifically over the other three. Talents for Discipline are relatively straightforward, with 1.5 tiers being the only thing we'll be changing depending on the situation. The first row being our 0.5 in that. Starting with the least used ability in the row, Schism. Schism can be fun and it's kinda cheesy to take on lower level keys. It's a nice damage boost, and when used properly, it can shine when you don't need the other options. I like running it when we're just goofing around in like 16 or lower. Unfortunately, it requires a pretty strict rotation, one we can't afford when there's actual damage going out. The most crucial choice for high level keys in this row would be Twist of Fate. If you can proc it regularly, or at least during crucial moments, then Twist of Fate is the most important choice. I'll go over them more in depth later in the guide, but the talent ring gives us Twist of Fate, so I would recommend running that to open up our last option, Castigation. Castigation is awesome, and is in my opinion the go-to choice, assuming you can run the talent ring for higher keys. Castigation is a great damage choice, which also applies to our Atonement, and is only slightly worse than Schism depending on your LEGO choices. But it also buffs our single target heal from Penance, which is a lifesaver in a lot of scenarios where Shadow Mend won't cut it. Second row is going to be Angelic Feather. Move speed is king in this game, as avoiding damage altogether is a lot stronger than being able to reduce it. The reason we take Angelic Feather over Body and Soul being that we use Powered Shield more or less on cooldown, making it hard to intentionally use it for the run speed when we really need it. On the face of it, Body and Soul seems like an easier talent to use as you don't need to place the feather, but with some handy macros, you can easily consistently target yourself in situations that require quick reaction time. Masochism can see some use, but needs to be used with a very specific purpose. Level 45 row, your default choice is going to be Shining Force. The knockback can be a lifesaver to keep mobs away during skittering, to help your tank kite during necrotic, and to reposition mobs out of sanguine, or sometimes is like a ghetto interrupt on movable mobs. Psychic Voice can see some use for the same ghetto interrupt reason on things like Imps and Court of Stars, but generally speaking, Shining Force is going to be able to cover the same role while also bringing more to the table. Dominant Mind can be fun in some scenarios, but you'll see little use out of it apart from some cheesy moments in things like a teamed Halls of Valor. Overall, Shining Force is just way better. Level 60 is going to be Mindbender. Always. Mana consumption isn't really an issue since we can drink between pulls, so Shield Discipline isn't worth losing the damage, and Powered Solace just muddies up our already tight rotation. Since it's on a pretty short CD, you'll want to use it as much as possible, even trash packs to get through the timer easier. Level 75 is our other truly variable tier. Shadow Covenant will be the default, as it fills in some gaps we have in our toolkit. Our AoE healing is non-existent when we can't damage a mob, so Shadow Covenant can be a lifesaver for affixes like Bursting. Clarity of Will can see some use, as it is one more way we can protect against one-shots. You'll want to be deliberate in both taking it and using it, but there are situations where it will be the difference between group members surviving mechanics and getting smacked by them. Sanctuary is a great talent for low-level keys and the standard in raids, but it's outshined by the other two options in terms of effectiveness for dangerous keys and affixes. Level 90 is going to be Purge the Wicked. Divine Star and Halo are both really underwhelming, and the buff to our dot when we're spreading it out on an entire pack is key. Our final tier, the clear winner, is Grace. Our single target healing is going to see a lot of use in 5-mans, and you should keep in mind that Grace also buffs Shadow Covenant, turning a somewhat weak heal into a lifesaver. Power Infusion is one of those talents that's fun and low keys, but with it on a 2-minute cooldown and only 20 seconds of uptime, it's absolutely overtaken by Grace. Evangelism is useless in Mythic Plus, as it is super easy to keep atonements rolling when you only have 5 targets. With gear, there are only a few things to worry about. Tier sets, trinkets, legendaries, and the Netherlight Crucible. Since we already went over stat priorities, you know roughly what you're looking for in that department. When it comes to tier sets, you want 4-piece tier 21 for sure, and potentially 2-piece tier 20. Penance is hands down our most powerful spell, so anything you can do to buff it is fantastic. The 2-set bonus for T21 is great in 5-mans, as it allows us to always have a Radiance when our Penance is coming off cooldown, and it makes it easier to keep Atonement up on the entire group 100% of the time. The 4-piece buffing our Penance is crucial because of what I just mentioned about it being our bread and butter ability. If you're going to opt for the 2-piece tier 20, you want to make sure that you aren't losing a ton of stats, so the more forged up pieces you have for it, the better. I would look at replacing it with non-set pieces when the overall eye level gain is going to be between 60 and 100, depending on if the stamina and non-atonement healing outweighs the penance buff in terms of effectiveness. You'll have to feel that one out for yourself based on group comp and difficulty of the key. For trinkets, again, this is going to be pretty feel crafty, and you'll want to swap them out throughout the dungeon based on what you're up against and what you have available. The number one trinket, in my opinion, is the Deceiver's Grand Design. If you can get your hands on a high-ish eye-level version of this, you want to run it in most situations. The mastery is pretty meh, but the consistent hot makes up for it. And the deal maker, is that a term? Being the, oh crap, shield it puts on your target when they would otherwise potentially die. Other trinkets to look out for would be Amenthul's Vision, if you're insanely lucky to have it drop, like a certain rep pally on my friends list that I now hate. Or Ishkar's Fell Shield Emitter, if you can use it effectively to protect against one-shots. Potentially A&R's Compassion or Norganon's Prowess if you can upgrade them, and to a lesser extent things like the Acrid Catalyst Injector, Teratus Keystone, Carafe of Searing Light, and a high eye level Sentinel's Medallion or maybe Garothi Feedback Conduit. As with all things healer, you'll have to feel out what works best for you and your group. You will have varying levels of success based on you, your group's playstyle, and the dungeon affixes you're dealing with. Legendaries are a bit of a tier system, but there are obvious winners for different scenarios. Much like Trinkets, you'll want to be swapping these out a lot throughout the run. First place, in my opinion, is going to be Pridaz. As with most specs, Pridaz is fantastic for Mythic Plus. It's a huge boost to personal survivability, which is crucial in higher keys, and the stats on it are pretty freaking great too. My second choice is usually Soul the High Priest for more challenging keys. As I mentioned earlier, picking up Twist of Fate with this ring when needed frees you up to take Castigation and to switch off of it. Other legendaries to consider would be the Court of Maev, Skoldir, I still don't know how to pronounce that, and there could be an argument made for Velens, although I would tend to disagree with it. The belt will offer a huge DPS increase when you know you won't need to be healing much. I find it a lot of fun to use and will tend to run it during trash packs or non-tyrannical bosses. Bracers are great when there's going to be some barely lethal hits going out that need to be reacted to quickly within a single global. Again, you'll want to make the decisions on when to swap to which legendary based on your own practice and familiarity. Relics and Netherlight Crucible are going to vary a bit from our raid priorities, so I wouldn't recommend stressing over them too much if you're primarily focused on raiding with some dabbling in Mythic Plus. If we were to assume that you're never going to raid and you really want to focus on Mythic Plus with your Disc Priest, then you'll want to go for primarily damage boosts. Confession is still our best trait, so that won't change from raid, as well as Edge of Dark and Light and Shield of Faith seeing a lot of use. The one key difference I would note from our raid specs would be Lenience's reward, offering a lot less benefit compared to larger group content. Basically, you can pull double duty from raid traits with the exception of the atonement damage reduction. 0.5% per point is great when you have atonement rolling on like 15 to 20 people, but on only 5, it's pretty underwhelming. Second tier traits for the Netherlight Crucible should really only be considered when you have a choice between the two to make it to a solid tier 3 trait. In that scenario, top choice would be Light Speed. Otherwise, I would say aim for traits that boost both damage and healing, like Chaotic Darkness, Secure in the Light, Infusion of Light, and Shadowbind. Once again though, focus on tiers 1 and 3 for deciding which relic path to go with. Both enchants and consumables are really straightforward and don't require much discussion. Use Mark of the Claw for your neck, Haste for your rings, Int for your cape obviously, and Haste gems for sockets. Food buffs should preferably be Int from the feast, or Haste food if you don't have enough time for a feast. Prolonged Power is your go-to pot. Use it as much as possible throughout the dungeon, including trash packs. Augment runes are great and you should always have a ton on hand, or you can farm out Army of the Light rep for that perma rune. On to the complicated part. Your quote-unquote rotation is going to be the most challenging portion to explain. Unlike DPS, we don't have anything like set rotations for single target and AoE packs. Instead, we focus on finding a balance between pumping out damage and keeping the group alive. Obviously, keeping the group alive should be the number one priority, but in order to maximize your effectiveness, you'll want to try and do as much damage as possible. On pull, I'll throw Powered Shield on the tank before they run in, and immediately start spreading Purge the Wicked on every mob in the pack, except one. I'll usually use my penance to spread it to the last one to save myself a global. From there, I'll keep Shield on CD, using it either on the tank or a DPS if I think they'll get smacked. If I think group damage will be coming within the next 9 seconds, then I'll throw out a Radiance to get Atonement on the group and to take advantage of the 4-piece set bonus that buffs my penance. If it's relatively little damage going out, I'll smite spam between penances to keep heals ticking and put out as much damage as possible. If there's lots of single target damage going out or one group member is in danger of dying, I'll give them a few Shadow Mends and try to let my Atonement maintain the rest of the group as much as possible. Don't be afraid to use your penance as a single target heal either if you think it will save someone from death. Keeping everyone alive is obviously paramount due to the loss of DPS, potential for a wipe, and the timer penalty from letting anyone die. So to recap things to focus on, Keep shield on cooldown if you don't feel the need to save it for a couple seconds based on mechanics. Try not to let your dots fall off. Keep atonement rolling if there will be group damage, and penance should be on cooldown unless you need it for a key moment coming up. Your cooldowns will be pretty obvious as you progress through the dungeons and difficulties. It will largely be about learning the timings based on your group and the affixes. Things to keep in mind. Barrier is not only great damage reduction, but also buffs your atonement healing while others are inside of it. You'll want to use it in situations like the Lantern of Darkness and Maw of Souls. Don't be too afraid to use it when your group is reckless with their bursting kills either, but if possible, this should be a last resort for those incredibly silly predicaments. Rapture is very much a preemptive cooldown. You can use it when damage is random and in relatively quick succession. It is possible to use it in those oh crap situations, but to get its full effectiveness, you'll at least want to start it just before the damage starts going out. Light's Wrath is a lot weaker than in raids, but it's still a nice amount of burst healing and does a sizable amount of damage. Don't expect it to always top your group though if they're all in serious danger of dying. It can save the day, but keep in mind that it's most likely not going to bring people from 5% to 100. Pain suppression will most often be used on the tank, but it can be helpful when a DPS is being targeted and doesn't have a personal available. Think of bosses like Xavius or Fortified Torment in Vault of the Wardens. Use Mindbender more or less on cooldown to help with damage, but be aware that it can be used as a healing cooldown in some situations. Some other fun little tricks for priests to keep in mind. Shackle can be used as a ghetto interrupt in Blackrock Hold for things like Knife Dance. Mass Dispel can see use in places like the first boss in Court of Stars to keep your group from needing to spam jump. Don't hesitate to use it on a single target if Purify is on cooldown and something needs to be dispelled ASAP. Psychic Scream can also be used as a last resort group interrupt during AoE situations, a la the Impacts in Court. And Dispel Magic can be pretty fantastic when you lack a mage to spellsteal key buffs. Just some fun little min-max things to think about while you're practicing the spec. I went over UI and macros in my last guide, so for a more in-depth look at them, I'd suggest you check that out. Just to really quickly run over the basics for people that either didn't watch that or don't feel like jumping over it. Get yourself some strong raid frames to track health and mana, and importantly, debuffs on your party. I would recommend Voodoo, but it's personal preference. I'd say go for a cast bar add-on like Quartz to keep an eye on your latency on a cast by cast basis. Use something like DBM for easy shoutouts on mechanics and timers for bosses and scary abilities. And get familiar with weak auras for all sorts of benefits and tracking purposes. If you're a bit overwhelmed by it, there are a ton of resources online as well as weak auras that others have already made that you can just steal. You're going to either want to use mouse over macros, which I'll link to a few in the info section below this video, or click casting via something like Voodoo. Saving that half second it takes to click and then press your keybind is pretty huge. In that same vein, please don't click your abilities. You're hamstringing your own progression in the worst of ways if you don't learn to use keybinds. Just saying. Affixes are a huge topic to cover in this video, and it's already running pretty long, so I'll just briefly go over a few that people tend to struggle with. Bursting is the biggest offender in my opinion. We aren't very good at countering it as discipline, but we can combat it enough to be successful. This is going to sound a bit counterintuitive, but chain pulling during bursting can be incredibly effective for us. Discipline struggles with this affix primarily because we need a target to maximize our AoE healing. Having your tank grab another high health mob that won't stack the bursting effect before it falls off can be a huge help. Be sure that your group doesn't drop any more mobs before the bursting falls off though, and try not to grab something that will do AoE damage or crush your tank before bursting ends. Regardless of strategy, you'll want to take Shadow Covenant. Assuming you don't have anything to heal via damage, you still want to spread your atonement just before bursting starts, and spam Shadow Covenant as much as necessary to keep everyone alive. Even if you do have something to hit, don't hesitate to use Shadow Covenant at the end just to be sure no one dies from that last tick. Try not to use it before you've made the call that atonement won't cut it, otherwise the healing debuff it applies will mess with you. Another affix that can be troublesome is Explosive. You'll want a melee or a multitasking tank to keep the orbs from going off, but keep in mind that you can smite or hit them with 2 Purge the Wickeds to kill orbs off if no one else can get to them, or if you have enough downtime to deal with them. If an orb does go off, use Atonement to bring people back up, or hit a Shadow Covenant or two if more orbs are going to go off quickly. It's annoying when pugs slip up and don't deal with them, but we can be successful with this affix. Grievous sucks, but we don't get too hurt by it, assuming you plan ahead and your group members aren't lazy and or oblivious to it. Try and let your Atonement deal with it, but Shadow Mend or single target penance can be used if you don't think Atonement will get them above 90%. I'm lucky enough to have a prop paladin tank as my usual partner, so I can cheese this one with his strong single target healing. I know it's cheating, but hey, sue me. Those are the main affixes that specifically we have to worry about most, but every affix is going to take some practice and familiarity with your toolkit to counter it. If you've made it this far without turning off the video, well, congratulations, you are my favorite person. To wrap this all up, I would like to remind everyone that this is not the be-all end-all Bible of discipline. This is just how I choose to play it, and what I've found the most success with. If you play it differently and feel that works better, then that's great. I'd love to hear about it. Just keep in mind that as a healer, we all need to play around our own personal strengths, so you do you. Anywho, thanks for watching, guys. I hope this helped you feel a bit more confident in trying Discipline in Mythic Plus. As always, please smite that like button, penance the subscribe button, dot up the bell icon for notifications on when I put up new videos, and keep an eye out for my BFA alpha content over the coming weeks. Thanks for watching, everyone. Peace.